Hello, this is Landon McCarter, and today I will be talking about the sensation and perception of music. Globally, music raked in $31.7 billion as of 2025, which was the seventh consecutive year in a row that it saw an increase, meaning it's very important to us. And music is wonderful. It is ubiquitously human and arguably uniquely human. There are a few animal analogs of musicality, but none of them quite come close to the complication and coordination and relevance of human music.
This is Earth Radio. And now here's human music.
Human music. I like it.
Birdsong is a good example of something that's kind of musical. It is remarkably elaborate in some species. Songbirds can reproduce repeated motifs, hierarchical sequences, changes in pitch and tempo, and improvisation. Dr. Michael Fee at an MIT lab studies neural mechanisms that underlie vocal learning and sequence generation in songbirds, specifically zebra finches. His work has used single neuron recordings and circuit-level approaches to try and understand how the songbird brain is generating learned vocal sequences and motorically executing them. Dr. Fee's work suggests that birdsong is biologically prepared while largely learned. Genes build the neural machinery for vocal learning, while the specific song is shaped by social experience and imitation, and birds isolated from their family lineage have songs that are more similar to their parents' songs than dissimilar, but they're not nearly as similar as they would be if they had learned from their parents via imitation. Nonetheless, they still share their own little spin on the songs that they learn, and variation is not merely noise, it is actively generated during practice of their parents' call, and it helps them learn what motoric movements of their beaks will create the song that they're trying to learn. They do, however, change over time, meaning that each generation is adding its own little aesthetic spin to its parent's song. Michael Fee has shown that male zebra finches sing when they're alone, but this appears primarily to function as a vocal practice and the maintenance of their learned song. Their reward-related neural mechanisms are activated when they're singing, but only when that singing is imminently tied to a tangible reward, such as a nearby mate. So while reward-related neural mechanisms are involved in the singing motivation for these songbirds, we cannot conclude that these birds are singing for pleasure or for their own intrinsic enjoyment. Similarly, humpback whale songs are especially fascinating, and whale populations also exhibit cultural evolution. Their songs change over time and generations, and new patterns can be spread through existing populations. Tungara frogs have a very elaborate system for attracting a mate, where one male will give a simple call, such as whine, chuck, chuck, whine, and another male will repeat that theme, but add his own little spin at the end, such as whine, chuck, chuck, whine, chuck, chuck. And these frogs will continue through this process for a given number of repetitions, each one-upping the last one. And this shows a rhythmic sensitivity, but also a numerosity that is present even in these adorable little amphibious things. However, none of these quite approach human musicality and its level of coordination, variability, complication, and the intrinsic value that we derive from it. In one study from Winkler et al., 2- and 3-day-old sleeping infants had EEG electrodes placed on their scalp while they were listening to rhythmic sounds to test their beat induction, or their ability to anticipate an upcoming beat in a rhythm that they've been listening to for a while, when the beat is unexpectedly altered or missing a beat. Their ERPs showed a response each time there was a missing beat, about 200 milliseconds later, even when they controlled for acoustic differences in pitch. By 5 to 6 months, infants can recognize familiar melodies even when transposed in their exact pitch, showing a use of relative and not absolute pitch perception. This is something that adult humans can do, but animals cannot. Newborn humans do not prefer consonance over dissonance. So if you don't know what consonance and dissonance is, this is consonance. And this is dissonance. Newborns do not have a preference for this. They are insensitive to key and detect timing changes in rhythms regardless of cultural familiarity. For example, Western music typically has isochronous or even beats, such as boom bumps, while Balkan music, for example, often has non-isochronous or uneven rhythms, such as boom, 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 boom. 6-month-olds perceive both types of beats equally well, but by 12 months, infants perceive and respond most readily to the rhythms that are familiar with their cultural exposure, which would be isochronous for us Western infants and non-isochronous for Balkan infants. Preferences for consonants and dissonance are also culturally specific, believe it or not. In one study, members of a remote Bolivian culture with minimal exposure to Western music showed no preference for consonant over dissonant chords, rating them as equally pleasant. This suggests that consonance preference is not innate, but strongly shaped by exposure to Western musical experience. In addition to music showing up very early in an individual human's life, it is also anthropologically very, very old. A 40,000-year-old bone flute was carbon dated, and this shows that humans have a long, illustrious history with music, with singing likely coming long before these instruments were even being thought of. So, to the extent that music is innate, this means it is genetically predispositioned and a consequence of processes of natural selection. So a question emerges on what is the purpose of having music ingrained in our biology. Darwin speculated that it was for mate selection, likely preceding language itself. He has a quote that says, "As neither the enjoyment of nor the capacity of producing musical notes are the faculties of the least direct use to man," in reference to his ordinary habits of life. Thus, they must be ranked among the most mysterious with which he is endowed. He goes on to say, "It appears probable that the progenitors of man, either male or female, before acquiring the power of expressing their mutual love and articulated language, endeavored to charm each other with musical notes and rhythm." Attachment psychologist and developmental psychologist Mayer and Lispelke argued in one paper that the important function of music, evolutionarily speaking, is social, that mothers trying to soothe their infants who may be crying may not have the energy to be tending to them all the time, and music might be a way to let them know that the mom is not distressed, but she's nearby, and sort of soothe them. And they suggest that even infants use familiar songs to identify and learn socially relevant information about specific individuals, suggesting that music evolved partly as a means of social communication and bonding in early life. Similarly, evolutionary biologist and anarchist revolutionary Pyotr Kropotkin argues in his book Mutual Aid that sociability and cooperation are the major drivers of evolution. And he suggests that singing and other forms of collective behavior, such as wolves all howling together, can express in-group sociability, facilitate communication, and facilitate social bonds, giving them an evolutionary function. More contemporary evolutionary thinkers, such as Steven Pinker, view music as what he calls auditory cheesecake. He wrote that music is an exquisite confectionery that is epiphenomenal in value and serves no evolutionary purpose other than being what is called a superordinate stimulus. So the idea of a superordinate stimulus is like pornography or chocolate. We didn't evolve to like these things because our ancestors who ate chocolate and watched pornography passed on their genes. Rather, we evolved a taste for sweetness and a drive to reproduce because of natural sugars found in fruits and the drive to reproduce. These biologically selected for mechanisms are incidentally exploited by these hypersalient stimuli. And this is what he thought music was, is that it's just coincidentally scratching a number of deeper itches that we have cognitively, such as the urge to count things and do math and relate things spatially and cooperate socially and express our identity, all of those things. One interesting thing that could provide some insight into music perception is sometimes people perceive music when there is no actual sensation of it. For example, Mrs. O.C., in Oliver Sacks' book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, suddenly begins hearing vivid Irish songs from her childhood, apparently originating from temporal lobe seizure activity. The music was so realistic that she initially thought that a radio was playing somewhere, and she found the hallucinations beautiful and meaningful to her, and actually felt a great sense of loss when they stopped. Conversely, Mrs. O.M., in the same book, heard repetitive songs such as Easter Parade and similar hymns, but she came to hate them, and she hid them from people in her family for years for fear that they would think she's going crazy and stick her in a mental hospital, and endured them even though they were relentless and distressing. One anecdotal thought that I find very interesting is my subjective phenomenological similarity between religious and spiritual experiences and musical experiences. And there is a condition called Geschwind syndrome, which is a specific type of intractable epilepsy and temporal lobe seizures, wherein a patient will become hyper-religious and inordinately spiritual, following seizures originating in the specific area of the temporal cortex. Which language and audition more generally are very temporally located processes. So I think there's an interesting paper there, but I was not able to find anything that looked into this deeply. However, this raises an interesting question, one that might help us understand what purpose music may have evolved for. What are the neural mechanisms that underlie the sensation and perception of music? And are they dissociable from the mechanisms underlying spatial reasoning, numerical reasoning, language, and other cognitive functions? So to begin to get at this question, we will very quickly go over some of the basics of auditory perception more broadly that are particularly relevant for music perception. So sound enters the ear as air compressions. It travels through the ear canal and vibrates the tympanic membrane. From there, it is transmitted via the ossicles to the cochlea. The cochlea transduces sound into neural impulses, with different regions resonating to different frequencies. Nerve cells along the cochlea transmit these signals subsequently to the brain. While initial auditory processing is similar across species, human cortical audition is likely more profoundly specialized. Auditory information first reaches primary auditory cortex, or A1, which lies in a superior surface of the temporal lobe, buried deep inside the lateral sulcus on the transverse temporal gyri. Functional MRI shows that A1 is a frequency map. The cochlea already maps frequency, but this is preserved through the ascending pathways into A1. Humans show a stereotyped high-low-high frequency arrangement in A1, forming what is called a tonotopic map, or a continuous gradient that is visible on both hemispheres. And so you can conceptualize this using a spectrograph. These neurons are selective for specific orientations on this graph, which are changes in frequency over a given amount of time. So the primary way to discover whether music is co-opting neural machinery meant for language is to functionally define language regions in a participant and then test them on music to see how they respond, and then do the opposite, to functionally define music-specific regions and test them on language. So, along the line of inquiry of whether music recruits neural machinery for language, neuroimaging often shows overlapping activation in areas like Broca's area. However, these findings traditionally relied on group analyses, where areas were averaged across many participants. However, language areas and music areas arrive in different anatomical places in different participants, and this completely blurred individual variability. So in an attempt to use individual localizers and compare within participants, in this paper by Chen and Fedorenko, 2023, the human language system, including Broca's area, was shown not to support music perception. So this is exactly what they did. They showed individual sentences compared to non-words and subtracted the difference to define regions in the participant's cortex which responded selectively to sentences in the language which they spoke. They then presented intact melodies, scrambled versions, and various control conditions to test whether these language regions showed any sensitivity to musical structure or content. In parallel, they examined independently defined music regions to test whether these areas responded to linguistic structure, like sentences and non-words. Language selective regions exhibited no increased response to any form of music, including intact versus scrambled structure, indicating no engagement during musical perception. Conversely, music selective regions did not differentiate sentences from non-words, showing no sensitivity to linguistic structure. Together, these results indicate a double dissociation. The high-level language system, including inferior frontal regions such as Broca's area, do not support music perception, and music selective regions do not support high-level language processing. But in another paper from 2015 by Kanwisher and colleagues, they used a variant of independent component analysis to discover 6 components that account for most replicable variants. So traditional hypothesis-driven approaches are limited to what researchers can think of as hypotheses to test. Fedorenko and Kanwisher used a data-driven method. They scanned subjects, listening to 165 common sounds, and measured voxel responses, creating a very large representational matrix. Emerging from this were 6 components which predicted most of the variation in amplitude of activity. 4 of these reflected basic acoustic properties, such as frequency, but the other 2 were more interesting. One of the components that emerged was speech selective. High responses to English and foreign speech, phonetic syllabic sounds, not necessarily words that you know in your language. This predicted a lot of the variability, but also the other component revealed musical selectivity. Projecting onto the brain where these components showed most of their predictive power, you also can reveal an anatomical dissociation. Speech selective cortex is below primary auditory cortex, but music selective patches are in front of and behind it. In a 2013 paper, functional MRI provided another perspective. In this study, they used speech clips that once looped transformed perceptually into melodies.
You know, sometimes I just feel like I'm in a creative rut, you know? Like there's just no possible way I could come up with another idea, 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 another idea.
They show the brain regions responded differently once the clip is heard as music than once it was heard as speech. So in conclusion, while I am running out of time here, there are studies that are analogously done and should be done to further dissociate music processing from other forms of cognitive processing, like numerosity or social emotional processing. And further work could be done to show what these different networks might additively account for in music perception. However, the studies that we went over today suggest that music and speech rely on at least partly distinct neural mechanisms. Even when the same auditory input can be perceived as either speech or song, there are dissociable networks involved, supporting the idea that music is not co-opting the neural machinery of language processing.